I will start sharing my screen so that you can all follow what I'm going to talk about. I hope this works and you can all see it well. Yeah. I'm going to talk today indeed about my ERC Consolidator grant, which is called MyMove, and that is about migrant youth mobility in Europe, where I look at the processes as well as the antecedents and consequences of that. For the talk for today, I will talk about particularly the diversity in childhood mobility, and I will take a little bit of a life course perspective there. Before presenting some of the results, I thought it would be good to introduce a little bit the project and its aim so that you have an understanding of what we're trying to do within this project at NIDI. We have a team there of, in total now, 4 PhD students and 3 postdocs and several other people involved in different countries. But I will tell you a little bit more about that in a second. What we don't know very much about is what happens to children in their childhood when it comes to moving. So we know a lot about migration in adulthood, both international migration as well as moving within the borders of a country. But moving in childhood and how that affects later life is actually largely unknown. And that is exactly the aim of this project, to look at what happens to children and then see later in their lives what is actually the outcome of that, both in positive and negative potentially. So what I've been drawing here is kind of 3 kids from different backgrounds. That is why they have different colors. They're boys, girls, and they all move in childhood. And what we want to know, particularly the internal moving in the country. So some of them might have already come from outside. For example, in this case, I've drawn a map of the Netherlands. They might have come from outside the Netherlands to the Netherlands, but I'm particularly interested what is additional moving within the borders of a country is due to a child, and compare that also between children who indeed came from across the borders and those who are of non-migrant origin. And then look on the one hand at these patterns that I will also discuss and describe today, but also try to see what happens if these children get older and what that effect of moving might have on their lives and their choices in life. Well, we do so in Europe. So today in my presentation, I will talk mainly about the Netherlands because that's where we have the data and where we did most of the analysis. But it is really the comparison also what happens in different countries and also for different groups of migrants. So some people come to Europe because they were fleeing war, others come because they are joining a family, and all these different reasons for, first of all, coming to Europe and then moving further within a country can affect, obviously, the life courses of these people. I'm interested in the end to study how it affects, on the one hand, forming families and relationships, but also how it might affect breaking up of these relationships. So that's why in the first row you see both love and a little bit of an argumentation in terms of breaking up. So that's one of the elements we want to look at. And secondly, we want to look at how this mobility over the life course affects health and well-being. So both physical health as well as more mental aspects of well-being and life satisfaction. Well, I'm not going to look into this all in detail here, but I just wanted to highlight, we try to compare across Europe. We try also to look at these paths and include different elements of the moving, because a lot of the research so far that's been done just looks at those children who moved or didn't move, or just looks at why they moved. And here we want to include both the timing, the reason, and also the trajectories these kids moved, and not just one move, but really the sequencing and also the numbers of move. We need to follow, therefore, people over their lives. So on the one hand, we need to know when they moved in childhood, and then obviously you still need to have the same people there to also see how that affected their lives when they were, for example, 18 or 25 or even 35. And we definitely want to correct, obviously, for individual characteristics, for characteristics of the neighborhood, and so on, to really single out the effect of moving per se. And that brings together these 3 domains of research, both international migration literature, internal mobility literature, and on the other hand, also really life course studies. It's really at the intersection of these 3 that we are working. I've already mentioned we work together with a group of people across Europe. We have partners in total 7 different countries that are all colored black here. In the meantime, we've also added Spain, so it's even 8 countries. And we mainly use the population register data. I'm just going to here. The left-hand side is seen as indicating the population registers combined also with survey data, depending on the availability in the country, but also depending on the aspect we're studying. Well, that is the context of the ERC. We have been working on that now for almost 2 years, but it takes quite a while also to get all this data and this information, even when the population registers in the Nordic countries, but also in the Netherlands and Belgium, do cover this information. You need to reconstruct them. So you have to detract them from the files and work on that before you obviously can analyze. So what I will focus on in the first part is how child mobility actually takes shape. So who is actually mobile, when and where do people go? And I focus here on the Netherlands. As mentioned, we are working here with Statistics Netherlands and together particularly with Professor Marjolein Dast there. And the work I'm presenting here is part of the project that Helga Kuivenhoven, one of the PhD students at NIDI, is working on. Well, as I mentioned before, the literature so far has largely overlooked the different components that childhood mobility may take and the different elements that are potentially relevant there. Or they have only looked at one aspect. So, for example, just the timing. So when did people move, or just the distance that people moved. What we try to do here is to get an insight in 4 dimensions. On the one hand, more time-related dimensions, which means the frequency of moving. So how many times did a person move between the age of 0 and 16, but also when did that moving take place? I really look at childhood here. So it's really the mobility in childhood. And the reason for that is that the child very often, at least in these ages, has no saying about the moving. So it's a kind of an endogenous event happening to the person, and the decision is taken by the parents. If we would look into ages 17, 18 and beyond, then often, obviously, the move is also a choice of the child, him or herself, to either move out of the parental home or go abroad for whatever reason to study or work or join even with a partner. So we really look at childhood mobility to make sure that the moving itself is the result of the parent's choice. So on the one hand, we have these time dimensions. On the other hand, we have space dimensions. So we look where people move, so the distance between the addresses, so how far people moved, but also whether they really changed the place. So did they change the municipality? Because sometimes moving 10 kilometers can mean that you're moving within the same city, but it can also imply that you're moving across municipalities. So the distance would then be the same, but it would probably be a very different component. Since we use the population registers in the Netherlands, we are bound to the changes of address that Statistics Netherlands applies. And that means the child has lived 45 days at that address. So moves that are done within those 45 days are not registered as separate moves. So people who are very rapidly moving from one address to the other, those we are not observing. So we have at least the addresses for 45 days, and then the next one is registered, which in our case should not be that much of a disturbance, because the number of people that really move more often within such a short time span is extremely limited, and mainly pertains, for example, to refugees who are coming into the country and are sometimes redistributed because of the government policy. So we use the full population. So we have everybody who was residing in the Netherlands, and we take all the children that were born in the Netherlands between 1995 and 2013. Without an international migration. So we focus only here on those of migrant origin that are normally called in most of the literature the second generation. So those are born in the Netherlands, but they might have one or two foreign-born parents. But we're not including those who migrated at an earlier age to the Netherlands. And that is for reasons of comparability. In a separate paper, we will focus specifically on those people. But if you want to understand the differences between those of migrant and non-migrant origin for this particular description, we thought it is more useful to compare everybody who was born in the Netherlands and therefore also had the same opportunities in the sense, the same educational trajectories, were going to education in the Netherlands the full period of their life. We exclude institutional households, so children who are living in an institutional household are not included, but that leaves us with a population about 1.6 million children that we follow between the age of 0 and 16. Well, overall, what we see is that if we look at this population of 1.6 something children, then we have about 38% who never moves. So they never move throughout their childhood. And about 2/3 do move at some point, at least once. Compared to some of the US literature, the percentage of non-movers seem to be relatively high. So the literature that is available on this topic mainly comes from the US. And as you can imagine, it has a very different focus and perspective very often, because moving in the US is very often much more frequent than it is in Europe, but also for very different reasons and having very different distances as well. So this is one of the first studies that really looks at Europe in that sense. So the frequency of the move, as you can see here, I leave out all of those who did not move. So this is really the focus on the movers. And we see that about 60% moves once. So that means that the majority of children actually either don't move at all or just move once in their lifetime. And then you have about 25% of the movers moves twice. And a small group moves much more often, where I have to say that the majority is not going beyond 5 moves. So the outliers, and there are some outliers where people really move many times, but that seems to be a very specific and selective group that we're currently actually digging into a bit further. The mean age of moving is around 5 years of age, and that is an interesting age because that is where kids in the Netherlands are starting primary school. They start either at 4 or 5 years. Many start at 4, but you have to start at 5. So this is clearly potentially also moves that are linked to enrolling the kids in specific schools or going to better neighborhoods potentially. The average distance that is moved is very short. This is the kilometers. It's very short moves. We'll come back to that later on and showing you a bit more on that. The between municipality moves, so this is the median, is 2.4. And the between municipality moves is about 40%. Well, how does it look like if we look at the frequency of moving by different migrant origins? Well, you can clearly see on the left-hand side that the black bars are the non-movers, and then the lighter gray you get the more the kids have moved in childhood. And we do see a clear difference between the children without a migrant background and those with a background, where those who do have a migrant background move way more often than those without. And particularly in certain groups, there are many movers. So in the Surinamese, the Antillean, and also in the other non-Western group, these are just bivariate descriptive findings. We do see that it's not uncommon that a substantial share of those children move more than 3 times. And this can be potentially be disruptive events. That's the whole background. If you think about later life consequences, one might think that moving can be a disruptive event that could also kind of break up the social ties, and therefore might also have negative effects also later in life with people having many of these experiences. Some of the other literature also suggests that it might also be positive, obviously, that if you move many times and it's upward mobility to better neighborhoods, it could also be a positive effect. I'll say a few more words about that later on in the presentation. So when do people move in their childhood? Well, I indicated here the start of primary school and the start of secondary school in the Netherlands. And you see that the majority, or at least in many cases, the substantial share either moves before the start of primary school or around the start of secondary school, and that the line kind of flattens off after that. So this clearly suggests that parents take the school and the school period into account with moving, so that they probably try to avoid these disruptive events for their children when they're in a certain school, and they probably want to anticipate enrolling in a certain school, and that doing that by moving before the child actually enters the school. On this note, you see some differences between the groups, because we obviously plotted here the different groups, with the Antillians being much more likely anyhow to move, and you see the higher lines here. So over all ages, they have the highest frequency, and the Dutch have the lowest. So the gradient is also clear between those of migrant and non-migrant origin when we look at the timing. But the lines as such follow exactly the same shape, so it's not very different for each of the groups. Well, the average distance moved is mainly over short distances. Like you see, the left hand, so the darker the bar, the shorter the distance. Less than 2 kilometers is the most left bar. And you see that particularly the Moroccan and the Turkish group, by far the majority, move over very short distances. And it's only in the other group that distances increase, where it's still most common to move within 5 kilometers around where the child was born, and this where the first registration and population registers was taken. Then the differences between municipality and within municipality moves. It's quite interesting that there's one big exception. Moroccan and Turkish are much more likely to move within municipality than any of the other groups. So for most of groups, you see indeed within municipality to be important, most important, but it's extremely clear for those of Moroccan and Turkish origin, where this is the majority of the movers that are actually just moving within the municipality where they were starting off. So what can we conclude? Well, on the one hand, children of the second generation migrant background, they are more mobile and they move more frequently. They make the first move at somewhat younger ages, as we saw from the graph with the lines that we dotted there for the different origin groups. And the distance, where Surinamese and Antillians seem to move longer distance, Moroccan and Turkish origin, particularly shorter distance, and mainly also for these latter groups within the municipality. I'm going to skip these conclusions because I'm not going into the urban areas, because I saw that I have too little time for that. Well, can ask questions if you want to. Well, moving on to then the second part of this endeavor, because this was a very descriptive part, obviously. We continue studying childhood internal mobility. Why we're doing this, as I said, it's an important live event that can potentially have effects later in life. But actually the findings on the implications of moving so far have been really mixed. As I was saying before, some find relatively positive effect, very often linked to also moving to better neighborhoods, whereas others find negative effects and very often also linked to, for example, parental divorce or other events that were going together with the move. So the negative events are mainly framed in the sense of like having a stressful life event, disruption of the development of the child, but also the disruption of the ties of the child and the family at large, and therefore also the support network that parents might have to raise their children. Well, mentioned already the positive impact, so the improved environment, and particularly also then the disruption of potentially negative friendship ties. Well, this mobility is multidimensional. I already mentioned that. So we really look at different aspects. But when we think about it from a life course perspective, each of these elements can also clearly link to the accumulation effect that is stressed in life course research, where having multiple adverse events would probably have more negative effects. And that's probably indicated by the number of moves. The timing of an event in life is often stressed in life course research, and that is indicated here with the age of moving. But then the social relations and the linked lives concept comes back with the distance moved, but also partially in the change in place type. And also that relates to the societal and geographical context, as is mentioned in the life course framework. So this multidimensionality is important. So who is mobile? We do find, as I said, higher internal mobility rates for migrant populations, but we don't know that much about children. I gave you some insights for the Netherlands. We don't know that much about compositional differences, and that's what we try to do in this second part. We find children of immigrants higher internal mobility rates, and we studied that, and I showed you that descriptively. But now we move on to the next step, and that is what patterns then of childhood mobility can be identified among children, and how do these patterns differ? So beyond just the individual descriptive elements for those with and without a migrant background. And we include those different elements of the multidimensional concept of mobility. Again, we use the full population register. Again, all children born between 1995 and 2013. But now we randomly sample one child per household, which leaves us with close to 1 million children, which is about 19%, where about 19% of them are children of immigrants. So they have one or two parents born abroad. We use a k-means cluster analysis here for all those children who moved at least once. So we leave out in the cluster analysis those who never moved. We include the four mobility characteristics. I've elaborated on that before. And we then apply, based on those clusters, a multinomial logistic regression, where we take as a dependent variable the mobility clusters, as a key independent the migrant background of the child, and we control for some individual characteristics the family socioeconomic status, household composition, and the degree of urbanity in the first address, so before the move takes place. Well, what do we find? We find in total basically 5 clusters. So these are all movers. So there's a 6th cluster, which is the non-movers. They are not here in this graph yet, or in this table yet. So here we focus only on the movers. There's 5 types of movers. On the one hand, we have the cluster 1 and 2, which are both nearby movers, but some of them are preschool and other are the movers that are school-aged. And we see that in a percentage in total, that is the majority of the moves that are taking place. So the majority of moves are nearby, most often preschool and sometime within the school-aged years. The average distance is very short, as you can see. So this is really close by. So it's really nearby. It's really short moves. And the age of the move exactly links to the start of primary school, as well as the school ages after that, and then up to entering secondary school. Well, cluster 3 and 4 are the more distant movers. On the one hand, those are movers to more densely areas, and it's movers who are actually leaving these more densely populated areas and go to sparser areas. So the majority of the moves of distant movers actually are coming to more densely areas in the Netherlands. The average distance moved is larger. This seems to be mainly an urbanization effect, so coming from the more rural areas around cities, moving into the city, and some of them are moving to more sparse areas, and there you see that is often larger distances. In many cases, this is, for example, people leaving Amsterdam to go to live in the cities that are Almere and I forgot the second name now. Well, just outside Amsterdam in Flevoland. It's the new area that we in Holland, where we conquered the water and made new land in the old IJsselmeer. And part of these moves are actually linked to that kind of suburbanization processes. Well, then we have a group of frequent movers. As I mentioned, this is a very selective group. It's a small group of people, but still, it is an interesting group to delve in further for the future as well. Because about 14% of the kids move frequently, and on average, they move 4 times. And you can see that it's mainly distributed across 3-4 times, but you do have also groups that move 5, 6, or even many more times than that. When we then use these clusters in our multi-nominal logistic regression, we first include the individual characteristics here. And what we do see is that if we control for that, we still have the Turkish and Moroccan groups are more often the ones that are nearby school-aged movers. So they move less often before school, so less preschool movers, but they move nearby school-aged, or the distant movers to denser areas. So they either go to denser areas or they have close-by moves in the school age of their children. And that seems to be quite different from the patterns that we observe for each of the other groups. Surinamese, Antilleans, and other non-Western, as we already saw in the previous bivariate, also these multivariate analysis suggest the same direction. They are more often distant movers to either denser or to sparser areas. And in many cases also, they are more frequent movers. So these three groups are more likely to move more frequent. And that seems to be related to their family situation and family ties. I can say a bit more on the conclusions on that. If we focus particularly on the nearby school movers, and how that the distribution is over the different origin groups, then we see indeed that there is a clear concentration, particularly among the Moroccan and the Turkish group, so that they are more likely than the others to fall in this nearby school movers cluster. I'm going to skip this one in order to make sure that I make it nicely within time. I'm just going to show you the one on the frequent movers, again, in line with what we saw before. This is mainly concentrated in specific groups, Surinamese, Antillean, and other non-Western. Well, the conclusions. What we do find is that childhood internal mobility patterns are quite diverse. We can distinguish clearly 5 different types of mobility patterns that also might be linked to very different reasons of mobility, but also very different potential implications of this mobility in later life. So it clearly shows it's important to look at these multiple dimensions of mobility and also look at that from a comparative perspective for different origin groups, as it is not similarly distributed among each of the groups. So the children of immigrants generally also move more often across the board, but again, you do see differences in the types of move that we should take into account, and the compositional differences, because these last graphs I showed you were corrected for the characteristics as mentioned before. So correcting for the socioeconomic position, correcting also for individual characteristics. You see that the differences remain largely the same as what we already found in the bivariate analysis. So these compositional differences between groups only partially explain away the differences that we see. So that might implicate that there is very different dimensions of vulnerability for these children that we're not measuring here with these data yet. That really calls also for next steps to understand better why and how this is important potentially for children's lives and their later life outcomes. So what are we currently working on? Well, we're linking childhood mobility to outcomes, because what I've presented you here is only the first step in our work, where we really look at how does it actually look like childhood mobility and what different dimensions can we distinguish and are important. We're now linking that also to outcome characteristics, and we do that both with the Dutch registers, where we look at health outcomes, the same for the Norwegian registers, where we have detailed information about people's medicine use in later life. So we can study those who were in the country and see what kind of medication they use in later life, which is a good proxy for certain diseases and also well-being in some cases. But we're also analyzing and starting to analyze German data. We had collaboration with the Mannheim group with the SILS for EU data, and they retrospectively actually reconstructed in their last wave of the data collection last year. We worked together with making a module to retrospectively reconstruct childhood mobility patterns. So everybody was asked where they lived throughout childhood, so that even when you don't have registered data, you could still analyze this. And that data, obviously, with an oversample of migrants, also allows us to really delve into more mechanisms which are not often captured optimally in registered data. So we analyze different countries. As mentioned, we have collaborations in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the UK, Belgium, Germany, and in Spain in the meantime. So we really try to see also whether the findings we have here now for the Netherlands are they also similar in other countries? And so far, it seems that mobility is higher in Germany than it is in the Netherlands in childhood, where it is lower in Norway than it is in the Netherlands. So you do see interesting differences. But we also want to analyze different countries when we focus on specific groups, and we have made a start in doing that. For example, when we look at refugee children, because the policies for reception of refugees are very different in the different countries. And therefore, that could also is kind of an almost natural experiment, seeing how that also relates to different outcomes later in life. All right. Lastly, we focus on different migrant origin groups, as mentioned, for example, refugees and others, because what we assume that particularly also for children of refugee origin in the Netherlands, the policy is that they are basically taken to reception centers over the country throughout their application process, and only after that can settle in one place, whereas the policy in Sweden, for example, is very different. There, people immediately settle in the place where they also potentially can stay. So the effects on children might be very diverse. And UNICEF, for example, has pointed at this many, many times, but there is no study that is really kind of underpinning this also in real findings and trying to really see what the effects are and how bad it actually, or not bad it might be, to move in childhood. One of the last things I would like to mention, we're currently wrapping up a meta-analysis of all the studies that were done on childhood mobility and outcomes in terms of health. The majority of studies is done in the US, some are in the UK. And interestingly enough, you do see huge diversity in the potential effects that are there. And I'm happy to share, if you want to hear more about that, some more insights on that. And then also the paper, which is currently being prepared for being published in Health and Place. And with that, I would like to thank you all. And I am looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.